Good evening, everyone. Welcome to IPM Techniques. This is Shane Gebauer with BrushyMtnBeeFarm. We have tonight with us Lancaster Beekeepers Association in South Carolina. They requested this webinar, so we're going to sort of tailor it towards them. At the conclusion, we'll open up the session for question and answers, and we'll allow them to tune in. We'll unmute them and answer or ask some questions rather, and if time permits, we'll open it up to everyone else. But with that said, let's get started with tonight's conversation, which is IPM techniques. And I think before we get into some of the techniques which we're going to discuss tonight, it's worth sort of revisiting, or visiting rather, a definition of IPM. What is it? And this is a definition that I got off of EPA's website: an effective and environmental sensitive approach to pest management that relies on a combination of common sense practices. IPM programs use current comprehensive information on the life cycles of pests and their interaction with the environment. So in other words, in short, this is working with the biology, the behavior of your pests and trying to lessen the impacts on their hosts. So we'll be talking a bit about Varroa, so we need to have an understanding of Varroa, of hive beetles, of wax moth, the pests of concern. Try and understand its biology, how it reproduces, its behavior, and see if we can't find something which we can use to lessen their populations and lessen the impact to our colonies. So we've got to have an understanding of our pest and how it interacts with the hosts. And of course, some of the pests that we have in our hives these days are the Varroa. We've got the small hive beetle. We've got the wax moth. We've got Nosema, two different species of Nosema. And I'm sorry, I just got something saying that I was muted. Can everyone hear me okay? Someone just type in if they can hear me. Let me try and, yeah, okay, so it's okay. So that was just an isolated event. Sorry about that. Sorry for the interruption. So we've got Nosema species, both Apis cerana and Apis, I'm sorry, Nosema apis and Nosema cerana, and foul brood, as well as there's some others. And the ones that we're going to focus on here this evening are the Varroa hive beetle and wax moth, and we'll talk about some of the others as we continue along. So why IPM, first of all, before we get into this? Why even consider IPM when there's options out there such as Apistan, Checkmite, now Apivar? You can take a couple of strips out of a pack and throw them in the colonies and walk away. Well, we know now a lot of research has been done since the discovery, if you will, of CCD, the documentation, the describing of that particular disorder. And a lot of research has focused on pesticides, and we know that pesticides are accumulating in the hive, both pesticides which beekeepers are putting in there, as well as agricultural pesticides from the surrounding landscape. Pesticides that maybe homeowners are using on their lawns or gardens, and of course farmers that are using on their fields. These have impacts, studies have shown these have impacts on queens and drones, the fertility of these bees. There's also developed resistance now. There's well-documented resistance to Apistan, which the active ingredient's fluvalinate, and resistance to Checkmite as well, which has coumaphos as the active ingredient. Apivar, which has amitraz, is relatively new on the market, but amitraz has been used extensively for numerous years by people mixing up their own. The documentation of resistance there isn't quite as significant as it is with the fluvalinate and coumaphos, but there are some concerns that with continued use of it, that resistance may develop. And so, yes, while these things work relatively well when they're new, but in the long term, ultimately we start to see this resistance develop. And then for me, most concerning is sort of the synergistic effects of all of this. So you've got the compounding effects of the 3 bullets above, and you've also got the compounding effects of all these different pesticides, both ones that the beekeepers are putting in and the agricultural pesticides, having a much more lethal effect on the bees in combination than they are in their individual parts. And there was a fantastic study done just this past year. It was published in January or February. It was done at Penn State, where they did find a synergistic effect between fluvalinate and coumaphos and pesticides, agricultural pesticides that were also found in the hive. So these are really, this is very concerning. This is something that can impact the health of the colony and therefore the survival of the colony. And so this is just one few reasons why IPM makes sense. So let's move on now and talk a little bit about some of the things, some of the IPM techniques that we can employ to try and mitigate our pests. And let's start with Varroa. So let's first understand a little bit about the Varroa. And I'm not going to go into detail on the reproduction and the behavior, but hit some of the general things, which is essentially it's everywhere. If someone says they've got Varroa-free colonies, I am highly, highly suspect of that, to the point where I probably won't believe it if they're in the U.S. They are everywhere. While they're not very mobile within the hive, they are rather mobile within the landscape. And the reason for that is that bees transport them around. If you've got 10 hives in your yard, or even just 2 hives in your yard, you get bees that drift between those colonies. And this drift allows for the spread of Varroa from one colony to another. So if by chance you were able to bring in, say, a package of bees from an area that doesn't have Varroa and install it in your apiary, if it's around other colonies, the drift will bring Varroa to it. In addition, there's been studies that show Varroa spread from bee to bee actually at the blossoms. That a bee from my hive, which has a Varroa, leaves my colony and goes to the peach blossoms here up by the business, and a bee from the hives here at the business, which may not have Varroa on it, comes in contact with my bee at the flower. The two sort of touch, they mingle, the Varroa is then transmitted to the bee that comes back to the colonies here at the business. So while they're not very mobile within the hive, they do spread across the landscape, which is why they're pretty much everywhere in the United States. But the fact that they're not very mobile within the hive, they're a lot like ticks that sort of hang out on blades of grass or twigs waiting for a deer or a rabbit or something like that to walk by, and which they can hitch a ride. The mites inside our colony are very similar. They're hanging out inside the hive on bees waiting for the opportunity to transfer to another bee, but they're sort of they're fairly stationary. And we can use that to our advantage. The other thing that we can use to our advantage is that Varroa mites are not native to Apis mellifera. Apis mellifera is the species of honeybees that we manage. It's the European honeybees, so to speak. The Varroa mite is not native to Apis mellifera. On its native host, it parasitizes only the drones, which means they only go into the cells of drone larvae to reproduce. Now, in Apis mellifera, our honeybees, they do go into worker cells, but they still gravitate toward drone cells. The pheromones of drones lure them disproportionately to drone cells over the worker cells. We can use that. In addition, they're sort of genetically programmed, evolutionarily programmed to go for drones, because a drone, on average, takes 3 days more than a worker to mature. It's in the capped form for about an extra 2 days, and that affords the Varroa mite extra time to reproduce, in which it does under the capped cells. So they desire the drones, which increases their population, and from a Varroa mite's perspective, that's very, very advantageous. As a beekeeper, not so much. So of course, Here's some Varroa mite if you haven't seen some. This is what they look like on the bees. You can see here's one on the thorax of this bee, and here's one on the abdomen of this bee. And I'll also point out these wings. That's a classic sign of deformed wing virus. The real hazard with Varroa is that they vector viruses and allow them to become prolific within the bees in the colony, and that's really the health implications from Varroa. We now have a much better understanding of this. And just a slight tangent, we need to think about that when we're trying to get our hives healthy for winter, because it's very similar to a mosquito and West Nile virus or malaria, in which the mosquito is transmitting that virus while it's sucking our blood, much like the mites are transmitting these viruses while they're sucking the hemolymph, the bee blood. You can kill the mosquito, but you're still infected with West Nile virus, and the symptoms of that can last up to 3 weeks beyond the actual incident of contact when the mosquito bit us. And it's the same for these viruses and Varroa mite, that we may put a medicated strip inside our colony and kill the mites, but the reality is that does not make for a healthy hive, because those virus levels are still very, very high, and it takes several generations of brood rearing for those virus levels to come back down to a level which is healthy for that hive. So those of you that medicate late in the season, just before winter, your colony may have a low mite count, and it may have large number of bees, but it is still very unhealthy and may not make the winter. I often hear that my colony had so many bees, it was healthy, I treated for mites, but it just didn't make winter. Well, that may be the reason. So we've got to treat earlier. We've got to manage our colonies for these mites a little bit more efficiently. So what are some of the things that we can do? Screened bottom boards were one of the first things that came out in terms of IPM technique. There are some reports that I've seen that say, you can reduce your mite population by 15% by using screened bottom boards. I believe that to be a rather gross overestimate of their efficacy in terms of managing Varroa mite populations. The reality is it probably is down in the single digits in terms of the percentage of Varroa that it removes from the colony. But every little bit helps. The thing with IPM that we have to keep in mind is that this is a commitment. This is a long-term commitment that requires effort. The strips, the medicated strips we talked about earlier, you put them in, you walk away, and you're treating for Varroa. But IPM requires frequent effort to ensure, and multiple things going on at the same time, to bring that pest population down to a manageable level for the host. So every little bit helps, and if screen bottom boards remove just single digits worth of Varroa mite, that's worth it, in my opinion. So screened bottom boards are one form of IPM. Another is drone trapping, and we'll talk about this one in a little bit more detail. This is probably, in conjunction with the broodless period, some of the easiest things you can do to reduce your mite population. You're never going to get rid of them, but again, the goal is to bring it down to a population size which the bees can tolerate, in which they can still remain healthy. So we want to just try and prevent it from exploding exponentially. And of course, powdered sugar is something that people have used now. The sugar shake method for testing for Varroa mite within your colony has basically been applied to the colony itself, where you sprinkle sugar down onto the bees, or you blow it into the hive and cover them and dislodge the mites. There's also a few others. This is certainly not a comprehensive list. Small cell, I'll talk briefly about small cell foundation. It's not on this list. I had it on this list in a previous version of this talk. I've since taken it off. simply because the data do not support its efficacy. Now, there's a lot of people, and there may be some listening this evening, that are strong believers in small cell, and it's working for them. And if it is, great, keep doing it. However, the research does not support its efficacy in terms of reducing the mite population within the colony. And so that's why I took it off the list. But if it works for you, keep on doing it. And there's some other things too. But let's talk about the screen bottom board. So here's the screen bottom board, and you've got basically a grid down here that can help count those mites, so you can get a sense of what your mite count is. This can be either left in or taken out. If you want to monitor your mite drop, put it in. If you don't, you can leave it out and just simply let those mites fall down to the ground. Again, they're fairly immobile in that state, right? They're down there away from the bees, and so it's very difficult for them to walk back up whatever hive stand you may have through this mesh back into the colony. And so oftentimes they perish down there. And here are several mites pictured on this sheet here. Very, very tiny, about the size of a period at the end of a sentence in a textbook, perhaps just a little bit larger. So they're fairly small, very difficult to see, but certainly visible with the naked eye. Drone trapping. Now here's something that was researched up at Cornell years ago, Cornell University. Nick Calderon did some drone removal, and he published some results that said if you, now of course this was up in New York, but that study showed that in that environment, in that part of the world, if you did 3 rotations of drone trapping, you reduce the mite population below the treatment threshold. Now down here in southern climates, it may not be quite as successful because, one, our broodless period is shorter, which means the mites are reproducing faster, so we may have to do this more than 3 times, continuing throughout the summertime. So that's one disadvantage we've got in the southern climates. But basically, what happens here is we're working with the biology, the desire, if you will, the instinctual desire of the Varroa mite to gravitate towards drones. So you can put in one of these green drone frames. It's green, so it's easily distinguished from your other frames. There's also wax drone foundation if you still want to use the wax, if you don't want the plastic. But basically, it's drone-sized cells that the bees draw out as drone cells, and thus the queen comes along and lays drone eggs in them. And so what you do is you wait for these to be capped over and essentially imprisoning the Varroa mite inside that cell, and then you pull this frame out. You can freeze it for 48 hours, let it thaw back out, put it back into the hive, and the bees will uncap the cells. They'll cannibalize the brood, the drone pupa, recycle that protein, if you will, and they'll clean out the cells and discard the dead Varroa which have perished from freezing. If you want to be a little bit faster about it, you can also hold the frame at arm's length, sort of at an angle, and blast it with a garden hose, and the garden hose water shears the cappings off and flushes out the pupa and the Varroa. If you're a fisherman, I hear drone pupa are excellent fish bait. If you're a chicken, if you've got chickens, the chickens dig those drone pupa. Excellent source of protein for chickens. The problem with drone trapping is that most of us this time of year have our brood chambers, which may be in various configurations, but our brood chambers, and we've got honey supers that could be fairly laden with honey right now, stacked on top. And what you have to do is about every 21 days, now it's 24 days from egg to emerging drone, that's the maturation time for a drone, but we want to do it at about 21 days because we don't want these drones emerging out. Now some will, and that's okay, but we want to get this frame out before the bulk of them start emerging. So about 21 days, which means every 21 days you're having to go into your colony, unstack those honey supers that are heavy, put in take out the old drone frame, put in a new drone frame, restack your supers, and then go back 21 days later and do the same thing, and again 21 days later and do it again. It's very, very labor intensive. The other thing to mention here is that if you are a procrastinator, this certainly is not a technique, not an IPM technique that you should be using. Because if you procrastinate and go 30 days before you get to this drone frame, the majority of these drones will have emerged out, and you will be increasing your Varroa population faster than the colony would have otherwise. So you have to be diligent about removing these frames. Now, there is something that you can do, and if folks have tuned into me before, I've talked about this before. There's something you can do to make this a little bit more efficient. And if you're a novice beekeeper, I wouldn't suggest this, but if you're kind of that type of person that wants to experiment, give it a go. So what this is two colonies sandwiched together with a queen excluder straddling both of them, and it's a plastic queen excluder. A metal one will work, but a wood bound will not, because the queens will be able to jump across from side to side. But this forms a tight seal between these two colonies, so queens can't communicate. They can't get to each other and try and battle. But what will happen is the bees in the left colony will go up and feed the stack of supers that's straddling the two, and the colony on the right will do the same thing. And the advantage of this is that you can put these nuke migratory tops on the sides, and you lift it off, and there's your drone frame. So you don't have to unstack your supers. And this works very well. It reduces your mite populations. There was a study that was done that was published in Science of Bee Culture several years ago that documented this experiment and found that, yes, in fact, it did reduce your mite population and didn't impact your honey harvest at all. In fact, one of the benefits was that if one colony happened to go queenless, the bees from the adjacent colony helped maintain that brood and discourage an infestation of wax moth or hive beetle. Now, the disadvantage is that if a colony does go queenless, there's sufficient pheromone drift from the adjacent colony that the queenless one will not attempt to raise out a new queen. However, it's not all that difficult to simply take these stack. If the left colony was queenless, I could simply take these supers, slide them over onto this colony, pull the two apart slightly, and pop in a new queen, introduce a new queen, install a nuke, whatever it is I wanted to do to make this colony queen right. But again, these frames are accessible underneath this migratory top, so you don't have to unstack your supers. And in fact, you can pull out some of the other brood frames to inspect the quality and condition of your colony, the brood, the laying pattern of the queen, the vigor of the queen, etc. And some of the tidbits that you can glean by inspecting those frames. Powdered sugar is a method that people have employed. You've got various contraptions that blow powdered sugar up through the colony. You can sort of see the smoke-like sugar cloud coming out the top, and here it is as well. But a lot of people will just simply take a screen, and this is window screening, and cover the top of the hive and use a bee brush and sweep that powdered sugar down through the colony, through the frame, so that the bees get good and dusted. And again, what happens is the mites get dislodged simply because of the coating of powdered sugar, but also you can imagine these bees are going to be doing a lot of housekeeping and a lot of preening of one another, cleaning of one another, and that will also help dislodge the mites. Now, if you're going to use powdered sugar, it's fairly important that you have a screened bottom board to allow that surplus sugar to fall down out of the hive. Otherwise, it'll just start accumulating on the bottom board and making a terrible mess. So make sure you have that screened bottom board and perhaps a tray underneath it so that you can remove it from the area. But powdered sugar, there's really no good scientific data that's been published on the efficacy on powdered sugar as a form of Varroa control. There's a couple of researchers that are talking about doing the study, but I've yet to come across a good study that shows the efficacy of powdered sugar as a form of Varroa control. But we do know that it works and it does have some effect. And again, if it has some effect, that's to our advantage. Now, people that inquire about this often ask me, well, how often do I have to do this? How much sugar do I need to use? And to that I respond, well, it depends on your objective. If your objective is to try and to manage your Varroa population exclusively using powdered sugar, you should probably be doing this about once a week and using the amount of sugar that you see pictured on the hive there. But if you're doing this to sort of try and prevent the population from exploding and just sort of keep it relatively slow growing until you can use something such as a soft chemical like formic acid, the Mite Away Quick Strips, or the Apelifar, then perhaps once every couple of weeks will be adequate. So it sort of depends on what your strategy is with the powdered sugar and how much control you're trying to achieve. So let's move on to small hive beetle now. The best thing you can do to try and to manage small hive beetle in your colony is a good, strong colony. There's great research that's been done that found bees will actually try to build a propolis jail with the beetles corralled within that jail. The problem is that as beekeepers, we come along, we crack the lid, and we break apart those jails which the bees are attempting to build, and at which time those beetles scatter. And if you've seen hive beetles, they're exceptionally fast, and they blend in very, very well against the dark comb. You can see a beetle here against some dark comb. They dive down into these cells and basically disappear from sight. And they try to evade the bees by hiding in small little nooks and crannies where the bees can't get them and can't try and chase them out of the hive or corral them into a propolis jail. But if you can maintain a strong colony, the bees will be very, very effective at containing these beetles so that they don't begin to lay eggs and begin to so they don't lay the eggs which they hatch into the larva and create this slimy, nasty mess. I talked to someone just recently that had a frame slimed, and they were just flabbergasted by how disgusting it really is. If you've ever come across a wax moth frame that's just been decimated by wax moth, that is a walk in the park compared to a frame that has been slimed by an infestation of hive beetle larvae. It's just absolutely awful. I mean, just you can see how these cells right here, it's almost liquefying and sort of oozing into itself. It's really awful. The bees will never ever touch it and never ever clean it up. So what can we do? Of course, maintain that good strong colony. There are beetle traps out there, different types. There's the hood beetle trap at the top, which actually is no longer available because it attached in a frame like this. It wasn't very popular. But then there's the beetle blaster. There's also, which is pictured at the bottom, there's also a beetle jail. There's other types out there. There's a relatively new product out on the market which is not yet in our catalog called the Beetle Baffle, which helps prevent the beetles from actually entering the colony. It sort of makes them walk around in circles and never really find the entrance. So there's lots of things that you can do to try and prevent them from entering and also contain them once they're in the colony. The other thing, there are some products out there that deal with the larva after they leave the colony, but the problem is after they leave the colony, they've left the mess behind. And so there is a chemical, which is an IPM technique, the guard star, but again, it treats the soil around that colony, and the larvae have already made their mess. But what these things do is they do prevent future generations from spreading and inhabiting other hives and decimating other colonies, and perhaps being the next generation of beetles that decimate the hives from which they've come. Some other things that you can do, someone suggested applying like diatomaceous earth, which is basically diatoms. It's you can pick it up at pool supply places, and sprinkling it around the ground. What happens is it's essentially shards of, you can think of it as shards of glass, and as the larvae crawl through them, they get sliced by these little tiny diatoms, and they dry out and die because of all the little lacerations to their exoskeleton. The other thing you can do is you can put down black plastic around your hive, so that as the larvae leave your hive and they scurry along the ground to go pupate into the soil, they have to crawl along that black plastic. If it's a sunny day, they may dry out. They may not make it to that soil to burrow in, to pupate. If you want to really get carried away, you can put some concrete, form a little concrete pad so that those larvae dry out and have to, as they crawl from the hive, to get to the soil. And it also increases that distance in which they have to travel, which increases the likelihood in which they will not make it. The next thing we need to talk about is sort of storage of equipment, both for beetles and for wax moth. So wax moth, again, is an opportunistic pest. It's one which is more opportunistic than the hive beetle. And what I mean by that is the hive beetle in certain areas can overwhelm even strong colonies. But wax moth, it's rare that they gang up to such an extent that they overwhelm a colony. So they really are opportunistic. And if you have a colony that quote-unquote was killed off by wax moth, I would hazard a guess that the wax moth is a symptom rather than the cause of its demise, of that colony's demise. In other words, perhaps it went queenless and we didn't notice. Perhaps there were a high Varroa infestation, and therefore the bees were unhealthy and the population was suffering as a result. And so they weren't adequately, there weren't adequate numbers to defend the colony against invading wax moth. Perhaps there may be too much space. So you've got a new package of bees that you've just installed, but you've stacked up too much equipment, and the bees simply don't have sufficient numbers to defend that space. The queen may be vigorous, the bees may be healthy, but the numbers just simply aren't there. I had a customer call me, and that was the situation that they had. They installed a new package, they put 2 deep brood chambers and 2 honey supers on it right from day one, and there was just simply too much space there for that package to defend, and thus the wax moth were able to come in and inhabit that colony and cause problems. The thing with wax moth is that there's no form of wax moth that can survive temperatures below 32 degrees. So eggs, larvae, adult wax moth all perish below temperatures of 32 degrees. And so what this beekeeper, this is actually from Ross Conrad that wrote the book Natural Beekeeping. So this is how he stores his frame. Now he's up in Vermont, which is a little bit different than North and South Carolina. But you can store your equipment outside. What happens is both the temperature works in our favor. The other thing that works in our favor, and what this little device, this storage method that he's using here, what this does is it helps ventilate the equipment and also allows sunlight to hit the equipment to some extent. Now, of course, it's under cover, so the sun's not beaming on it and melting the wax, which could happen down here, but there is ventilation and there's light, and ventilation and light also deter wax moth. And then, of course, once winter does set in, even here in North and South Carolina, particularly this past year, we get temperatures that dip below 32 degrees and therefore sort of sanitizes that equipment of wax moth, so to speak. So this is one way to store your equipment. This is another way. This is from one of Kim Flodham's book. It was a picture that was sent to him. This is an easy little rig that someone built out of cinder blocks, PVC pipe, and 2x4s and a piece of corrugated metal. It does the same thing as the previous photo in that it allows ventilation, it allows light, and it also allows for those freezing temperatures. The thing that I'll mention here is that if you keep your honey frames separate from your brood frames through the use of a queen excluder. Now, I know some people don't like to use queen excluders, but if you keep your queen off of the frames in which the bees are storing honey, so the only thing that goes on those frames is honey, and you extract that honey and you allow the bees to dry up the frames once they've been extracted, in other words, let them clean up all the wet residual honey that may be on them, wax alone is not a sufficient diet for wax moth. So you can pretty easily store frames from honey supers that have only ever had honey in them outdoors and not have much problem with wax moth. I have some in my backyard that didn't make it onto hives this year, but has only had honey in those frames, and I do not have any wax moth signs on those frames. And I did that last year, I've done it this year, I've done it for years. So if you keep honey frames pure and clean and only allow bees to store honey in it, that will help with the storage of your equipment and deter an infestation of wax moth. Now, if you get into frames that have brood, or that have had brood in them, now you're talking about a little bit from a wax moth perspective, a little bit better diet, because you've got the cocoons from the pupating bees. You've got the defecation from the larva that's been in those frames. You've got pollen residue from where the bees have stored pollen to mix with their food to feed the developing brood. So you've got more nutrients in your brood frames and not enough in your honey frames. So if you're looking at the brood frames, you're going to have to do something like this. But there again, the best method is simply to get bees back on that equipment as soon as possible so that the moths don't have a chance to get in there and create a problem. Again, another little aside, the Bee-Informed Partnership that tracks winter losses and management techniques of beekeepers has found that equipment that has not been stored, in other words, equipment that may have had a dead out but was immediately restocked with bees or shortly thereafter restocked with bees, those beekeepers that are doing that have lower losses. So in other words, higher success in overwintering than people that store equipment and restock it the following season. So there's real advantages to getting bees back in equipment that may have been from a dead out rather than storing it and trying to keep it over winter and prevent wax moths from getting into it. And of course, good hive health is one of the best defenses against diseases and pests. So feeding both protein and carbohydrates. Now, I've got a pollen patty up here. If you're in an area that's got large beetle populations, don't slap down a pound of pollen patty onto that hive, because chances are the beetles can get to it, lay eggs in it. That provides a nice little hiding place for the developing beetle larva, and the bees can't get to it. They won't consume it fast enough, and you'll actually be adding beetle larvae to your colony. So if you're in an area that's got beetle larvae, just give them like a quarter of a patty. If they consume it, give them another one. But just feed it piecemeal like that so you're not providing a suitable environment for beetles. Mix in a little bit of Honeybee Healthy also helps. Here's something that I learned recently, that there seems to be, and this is still kind of in research stage, but there seems to be a link between corn syrup and hive beetle populations. So using sugar syrup over corn syrup is better for that colony to deal with the beetle population. Perhaps we're still looking into that. I should say the researchers are still looking into that. But a good, healthy hive is some of the best defense you can have against diseases and pests. Culling out old, nasty frames. Helps relieve some of the stressors from pesticides. So even if you're a quote-unquote organic beekeeper, your bees are still bringing back agricultural pesticides, and those are accumulating in the wax inside on those frames. And that's essentially why we don't have organic honey, because the bees forage in a roughly 2-mile radius, and they're coming in contact with these pesticides and bringing them back to the hive. So a good comb rotation practice is to your advantage. Every 3 years you should have a complete turnover of your brood comb so that you get those toxins out of the colony and they don't reach levels that become stressful for that colony and affect the overall health of the colony. So a good comb rotation will help. And of course there's some other pests out there that are difficult to deal with. Skunks, bears, mice. The best defense against mice, of course, are entrance reducers to prevent them from getting in there in wintertime. Bear, electric fence is your best bet, and putting that fence up before the bear finds that colony, and perhaps even putting it up before the colony is there and baiting the bear in with bacon so that the bear sniffs that bacon and gets zapped on the nose or tongue, which of course is very, very sensitive. The reality is a bear could plow right through just about any electric fence you could put up without incident. But you train it by zapping it on a tongue or a nose, and it learns very quickly. They're smart animals. It learns very quickly that this is not something to mess with. And skunks, one of the best defenses there. Elevate the colony so the skunk has to go up on its hind legs to scratch at the colony for the bee, and as the bees come out, it chews up the bees. But if it's elevated and scratches at the colony, it exposes the belly of the skunk a little bit and makes for a nice target that the bees hit and discourage that skunk attack. So, and there's other things too. I'm not going to get into them. They're arguably inhumane. I've heard people putting sheets of plywood with screws sticking up through them around their colonies to deter large pests. But electric fence for bear, elevating the colony for skunks, those are probably the most common and widely accepted practices for discouraging those larger pests. And of course, again, the reducer for the mice. So with that, we've hit the end. So let me, I'm coming to you, Lancaster. Hold on, let me open up the attendee list and find you in the list. Where'd you go? And we'll unmute you, so get your questions ready. And I think you're good. Dale, are you there?
Yeah, can you hear us?
I can indeed. I can indeed. Yeah, what's your first question?
Shane, can you hear us?
I can. Can you hear me?
Okay. Yeah, we can hear you fine.
Great.
Are there any chemicals that you can put in the beetle traps to deter the beetles that will kill the beetles where they'll die in the trap and not come back out and walk all over the frames?
So there's several, I shouldn't say several, but there are a couple of traps out there besides the ones that I pictured that people are using. Essentially, it's a roach killer that you can buy at hardware stores, and you fill these traps up so when the beetle goes in, it comes in contact with that substance and kills them. So people are doing that. People are putting diatomaceous earth in some of these traps, which kill the beetles. I have to be a little careful here, guys, because as a bee supply company, these products, these methods are not registered, approved treatments for hive beetles. So using roach killer in a trap, technically speaking, is a violation of the law, and the label is the law. So as a supply company, I can't say, yeah, go ahead and do that, because I'm advocating or promoting something that's illegal. So I can't do that, but I can tell you others are, and they're having good luck. I have a bit of concern that the beetles may leave that trap and track some of that substance throughout the colony. So you've got to be very, very careful about that. But yeah, there are some things you can put in there, but none of them are registered as as a legal treatment for hive beetle.
Okay, Shane, and you touched on diatomaceous earth, and I'd be a little leery about putting that in a hive also. But basically, like you said, it acts like a razor blades. It'll cut up silverfish, roaches, beetles. But
And
they got on the bees, their wings, it could also cause problems with them, couldn't it?
Yeah, it can affect the bees as well. And so that's why, again, you do have to be careful that the beetles are not able to exit these traps and track that around, because it will impact, could potentially impact the colony. That's why I think perhaps spreading, if you wanted to use diatomaceous earth, spreading it around on the ground outside the hive, while that it doesn't really do anything for the beetle problem inside the hive, but it does help deal with the larvae as they leave that colony to pupate in the soil and prevent future generations. And with it being around the colony in the soil, it's less likely, much less likely, that the bees will come in contact with it in sufficient amounts that will cause problems.
Okay. What about ants? What's a good defense against ants in the hive?
So that's a good one. So I need someone that's got an ant problem, because I don't have an ant problem, but someone has told me.
Okay,
and I've heard,
I had an ant problem.
You had one. That doesn't do me any good, Dale. I need someone that's got one, because someone's told me, more than one person has told me, that that if you take a twig from an apple tree with the leaves, that there is that sort of almond extract that's in that apple twig deters ants. And so if you lay it on your inner cover, which is where the ants often form little colonies, if you lay it on your inner cover, it deters the ants from sort of setting up shop on the inner cover, if you will. The other thing is that you can do cinnamon around the hive, which deters the ants, but that can get very, very expensive very quickly. You can also create little reservoirs on your hive stand that basically the ants have to try, like a little moat, so to speak, on legs or something like that on a hive stand, that the ants have to try and get across to get into the colony. And if they do happen to get into the colony, of course, they've got to leave that colony as well to go forage for necessary resources. So they're having to navigate that moat back and forth, and that can also deter them as well.
Okay, have you heard of using salt?
I haven't. Tell me about it.
I actually had a problem with the big black carpenter ants a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
And it was on one of my strongest hives. It was in the late fall, and I opened up the top cover, and there must have been 200 big black carpenter ants. They were laying eggs. So I cleaned it off, put it back on, went out the next week and checked it, and had the same problem. There were 5 hives lined up, and this was the strongest one, and I guess it was because of the heat that they were giving off. But anyway, I got online and I Googled carpenter ants and honeybees, and got into a blog, and this guy said to use some regular table salt and sprinkle a little bit around your inner cover. So I went back down there and put it around the inner cover and closed it up, went back the next week, no problems. And I imagine with salt too, I mean everything needs salt, so it wouldn't be detrimental to the bees. So, but I had good success with it.
Interesting. Someone that's typed in a question said that that it also may be effective in deterring hive beetles. I'm not quite sure about that, but maybe that's something worth experimenting with.
Absolutely. Does anybody else in here have any questions? Yeah. Right. Yeah, I know. I had one guy was saying that he would take pieces of corrugated material and put them in there, and it would drive the beetles into the corrugated material. I also know some other people that did that and used the roach killer too, but we know that's a no-no.
Yeah.
Is there any other questions?
Oxalic acid.
Huh?
Oxalic acid.
Oxalic acid for mite treatment? I'm not familiar with that.
So yeah, so oxalic acid, it's more of a soft chemical than an IPM technique, but it is considered a soft chemical. It's an organic acid. It's very similar to formic acid in terms of that sort of soft chemical classification. Oxalic acid, so here's something really kind of exciting, actually. Oxalic acid currently is not registered in the United States. So again, if it's not registered for mite control, technically if you use it, you're in violation of the law. However, it's been legal up in Canada for quite some time, and if you want some information about it, you can Google Canadian Honey Council oxalic acid, and it brings you right to, the first link is the Canadian Honey Council's page regarding oxalic acid, how to use it, etc. It comes in crystalline form, and there's two ways you can apply it. You can mix it with a sugar syrup and trickle it, drizzle it basically down through the frames onto the bees. Or you can put some of these crystals on a little heat pad that heats those crystals and causes them to vaporize, and the fumes disperse inside the hive. The vaporization method, and you can actually see, and I think in some of the magazines they're selling oxalic acid vaporizers, even though technically speaking it's illegal. The concern with the vaporization method is that you are creating these fumes, and if you inhale the fumes of oxalic acid, they can be dangerous. But the trickle method has a great deal of appeal for me. I have tried it in the past on some experimental hives and found it to be very successful. The deal with it is, though, that it does nothing for mites under the cell. So in other words, the mites that are inside the cells reproducing with the bees in the brood, it won't touch them. And if you trickle your hive, the oxalic acid is only there for a short period of time, and so those mites inside the cells are essentially protected. So the best way to apply it is during a broodless period. In other words, late fall, just before temperatures really start to drop and the bees go into winter. You don't want to wait too long because you don't want to be wetting bees in cold temperatures. That's a recipe for disaster. But you want to wait long enough that the colony is essentially broodless, so therefore all the mites or most of the mites in that colony are on the adult bees and therefore exposed to the oxalic treatment. Now, why oxalic acid is sort of exciting is because just last week at EAS out in Kentucky, I found out the EPA, along with USDA, is working to register oxalic acid as a recognized mite control treatment. And so hopefully within a year we'll have oxalic acid on the market as a recognized treatment. But it does work. Currently not technically legal, but if you want some information, go to the Canadian Honey Council and you'll find some information on it.
Okay, thank you, Shane. Does anybody else have any questions they'd like to ask? I think that's a wrap for us on the questions, and we certainly do appreciate you doing the webinar for us tonight.
Not a problem. It's my pleasure. We do still have just a couple of minutes left, and so if you don't mind, Dale, I'll put you guys back on mute, and I'll turn to some of these questions that people have submitted through the question panel. Is that all right?
Sounds good. Thanks again.
All right. Thank you. You all have a good evening.
You too.
So turning to the turning to the question panel, there's just a couple of questions here that I'll try and get to. And the first one, probably all I'll have time for actually, is this one, but it's a good one. So dealing with Varroa, I mentioned the broodless period as a good form of Varroa control. There's one of the theories behind why the Russian bees, the Russian strain of Apis mellifera, why they're so effective in dealing with Varroa is because they tend to be fairly swarmy. They swarm quite frequently, and so swarming is a form of brood production interruption, if you will. So, right, the queen is in there. The colony's preparing for the swarm. The swarm happens. The old queen goes with the hive, and you're left with a new virgin queen. Well, that new virgin queen has to go off on a mating flight. She's got to come back. So there is a period of time there where no new eggs are being laid in that colony. So basically you create, that swarm creates a broodless period. Now, I should say, I should clarify by saying that when I mentioned broodless period, I'm not implying that the colony is entirely without brood, but rather just simply there's a gap in production. And so a swarm creates that gap in production, as does splitting the hive, which sort of mimics a swarm, right? So you divide your hive, you split a good strong colony, you take some of the frames out. Those frames that are coming out, you pop a queen in there. That split now has a broodless period while that queen is being introduced, a gap in production while that queen is being introduced. You can also get a little bit more extreme about this, where you can actually cage the queen in like a queen cage, a queen frame similar to our requeening frame, contain her in there so that she simply can't lay. And so you artificially create that broodless period that way. But probably the swarms, you know, everyone tries to prevent the swarm because we want a good strong colony to maximize on our honey production. But a swarm, from a colony's perspective, is not a bad thing. In fact, it's an instinctual thing. It's how they reproduce. It's how the colony propagates itself. It's how the bees reproduce the colony. So they want to do it, and it also can benefit us because it creates that gap, as can splitting the hive. So that's probably one of the best methods of creating that broodless period. And so with that, actually, there's several other questions. Please feel free to shoot me some emails, or call our office, or shoot the office an email with your questions so we can get them answered. But we've come up on the 8:30 hour. We've been at it for an hour total. So I appreciate you tuning in. And Lancaster County, or Lancaster beekeepers, I appreciate you extending the invitation for this webinar and giving me the topic and the opportunity to join you this evening. I hope you found it useful and informative, and look forward to opportunities in the future. Thanks a lot, everyone. Have a good evening, and good luck beekeeping, and hope your honey's flowing and crop is good. Good night.